Civics Reading 3.1. What were some characteristics of colonial America? The United States was officially recognized as an independent nation in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, nearly 2 centuries after the first European settlers landed in America. Once colonies were established, one of the first things that the colonists noticed about their new surroundings was their vast size. England and Scotland together were smaller than the present states of New York and Pennsylvania. More than 1,000 miles separated the citizens of northern Massachusetts from those in southern Georgia. Of course, the colonists were not the first people on the North American continent. However, by the end of the Revolutionary War, there were relatively few Native Americans living along the Atlantic coast. Encroachment of colonial settlements, disease, and warfare significantly reduced the indigenous population on the eastern seaboard, although many Native Americans remained on the western borders of the colonial frontier and beyond. More than physical distance separated the colonists. Their backgrounds were diverse. Some, such as the Puritans in Massachusetts and the Quakers in Pennsylvania, came to the New World for religious reasons. Others came for economic reasons. They also differed in social structure and sometimes even language. Pennsylvania, for example, had a large German-speaking population. French and Dutch were important languages in other colonies. A few influential families dominated South Carolina, Maryland, and New York. They owned vast estates and tended to replicate European culture and habits as much as they could. By contrast, New England and Georgia had fewer large estates, and partly as a result had different social and political cultures than those found elsewhere. Most of the colonies also had established or official government religions. Slavery was practiced in all of the colonies. Almost all colonial Americans lived and worked on farms or in rural communities, but farming meant different things in different places. In South Carolina's coastal region, farming meant using slaves to work as plantations that produced rice and indigo for export, mostly to England. Virginia's export crop was tobacco. By contrast, farming in New England meant growing crops and raising livestock for a local market. New England farmers relied less on slaves for labor than did Southern colonists, but the New England workforce included thousands of indentured servants, many of whom entered into work contracts in exchange for transportation to America, food and shelter, or training in various skills. Colonists who did not work on farms followed various trades, working as sailors, shoemakers, silversmiths, and a host of other occupations. Many dabbled in a favorite American pastime, speculating on land. In many ways, colonial America was a society of traditions, in which people had played social roles and exercised authority in long-established ways. But more than 300,000 people in 1760 were enslaved. These people, or their ancestors, had been transported to North America as captives from Africa. Later lessons will examine the effect of slavery on American constitutional government and culture. Indeed, the British colonies developed a number of different ways of organizing local governments during the century or more of their existence. How did the founders learn about government? The founders learned about government from reading history and philosophy and from their own experience of self-government as colonists within the British Empire. They were as familiar with ancient Greece and Rome as they were with later European history. Many had read classical texts about government and politics by ancients such as Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 320 BC, Marcus Tullius Cicero, who lived from 106 to 43 BC, and others. They also had read newer theories of government by 16th and 17th century philosophers, such as Thomas Hobbes, who lived from 1588 to 1679, and John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704. By the 1770s, some were familiar with the English jurist William Blackstone's explanation of English law, published between 1765 and 1769. Almost all were well-read in Protestant theology. The founders looked to many examples of good and bad governments for guidance. By 1776, Americans also could look back on more than 150 years of local self-government. Free white men from all walks of life had served on juries, attended town meetings, and voted in local elections. In fact, in the colonies and early states, more Americans participated in self-government than did people almost anywhere else in the world. So what did the founders learn about government? Not all the sources that influenced the founders taught them the same lessons. Some sources contradicted others. Some did not teach clear lessons at all. For example, classical political philosophers taught that human beings are naturally social creatures with obligations to each other and to their community, without which they could neither survive nor achieve human excellence. To Greek philosophers, such as Plato, who lived from 428 to 348 BC, those who govern must be wise. All the classic philosophers agreed that one purpose of government is to help people learn about and perform their civic and moral duties. Greek and Roman history taught that although democracies may appear to begin well, they tend to end in tyranny when the poor attack the rich. Class warfare breeds chronic disorder. The people then submit to tyrants, who enter the scene promising security. Natural right theorists taught that people have natural rights that others must respect. English philosopher John Locke summarized them as the rights to quote-unquote life, liberty, and estate, meaning property. People agree to form the society and create government to protect their rights. British history showed that even a monarch might evolve into free government. If the people are determined, they can ensure that monarchs respect the rights that the people have gained over time. American colonial history showed that local government could coexist with a distant central authority, in this case, Britain. However, American colonial history also showed that when people believe that the central government is abusing its power, then social and political unrest follows. The founders had many examples of government to choose from in designing their state constitution and the U.S. Constitution. Why did they make the choices they made? From reading their explanation in documents such as the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and various pamphlets, essays, and letters, it is clear that the founders had learned at least two important lessons about government. First, government should be the servant, not the master of the people. And secondly, a fundamental higher law or constitution should limit government. What forms of government could the founders choose from? The founders were familiar with the writings of Greek philosopher Aristotle, who observed that every state, meaning country or national entity in this sense, must perform three functions. First, states must deliberate about what is to be done and decide what public policy should be. Today we call this a legislative function, deliberating on and enacting law. Second, states must perform an executive function, through which public officials carry out public policy. And third, states must carry out a judicial function, through which disputes about the interpretation of law are managed and applied in everyday life. Aristotle also distinguished between types of governments on the basis of the number of persons exercising power. Countries may be governed by one person, a few people, or many people. Each of these three forms of government has a quote-unquote right form and a quote-unquote corrupt form. Right forms are governed for the common good, whereas corrupt forms are governed for the private interests of the rulers. The right form of government by a single person is called monarchy. The right form of government by a few people is called aristocracy, or the rule of the quote-unquote best. And the right form of government by many people is called polity. Aristotle referred to polity as a mixed form of government, or mixed constitution, because it incorporates elements of a democracy and oligarchy. No group of citizens, for example, the rich or the poor, is able to abuse political power. Although a polity is a mixture of social elements, it is most like a democracy, as we define the concept today. According to Aristotle, corrupt forms of government are tyranny, for rule of a single person, oligarchy, for rule of the few, usually rich people, and democracy, for rule of the many, by which he meant poor. The following table illustrates right and corrupt forms of government as identified by Aristotle. Please review this. To Aristotle, democracy meant direct democracy in which the people themselves make decisions, rather than the type of government we call democracy today, which is largely representative. Aristotle's description of democracy as a corrupt form of government refers to what ancient Greece experienced when the poor, quote-unquote, the many, took power. They attempted to seize the property of the rich for themselves, setting off destructive civil wars based on social class. In such cases, the poor looked after only their own interests, to the exclusion of the common good. Although Aristotle classified the governments of countries on the basis of their numbers of rulers, he also focused on economic consideration within countries, which usually are far more important. He was especially concerned with the distribution of wealth and the effects that various distributions have on political stability, specifically on the avoidance of civil strife. He concluded that the dominant group of most stable countries consists of those who are neither rich nor poor, but occupy a middle ground of moderate wealth. According to Aristotle, this middle group is known for moderation. Rule by those who are moderate yields the most stable form of government because those moderate means are most likely to behave in accordance with reason. In Aristotle's view, the problem with democracy is that the poor, who are numerous, attempt to seize the wealth of the rich, who are few. But if a constitution can combine the many poor with the lesser number of wealthy persons, then it can achieve stability. The founders were familiar with this idea of mixed constitution from reading Aristotle and other writers, such as Greek historian Polybius, who lived from 203 to 120 BC. Polybius popularized the idea in the ancient world that mixed constitution is a combination of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. This idea, embraced and passed on by the Roman statesman Cicero, then became widespread among scholars in the Middle Ages, roughly the 5th century to the 14th century, dependent on the country. Through Cicero's great influence in the subsequent period of the Renaissance, the 15th through 17th centuries, the idea of mixed constitution was incorporated into Renaissance political thought and thus into republicanism. It was then passed on to the Enlightenment in the 18th century. For example, the 18th century French political thinker Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu, lived from 1689 to 1755, cited England as a mixed constitution. The British government had a limited monarch, an aristocracy in one House of Parliament, this is the House of Lords, and in theory, the House of Commons for the common people. In fact, the landed aristocracy dominated the House of Commons, though they were of lower rank than the members of the House of Lords. Both the British Parliament and the legislators of the colonies were examples of representative government. This is important. Representative government sometimes is called republican government. The term republic comes from the Roman term res publica, which is Latin for thing of the people. The Roman Republic had an unwritten mixed constitution. Its form of government after 287 BC consisted of executive and legislative branches, in which virtually all classes and tribes in the Roman society were represented. Based on the founders' reading of history and their personal experiences, they did not believe that direct democracy was the best model for government. It could potentially fail to protect property and other rights, such as rights of minorities. The founders preferred a representative or republican form of government in which many interests can be represented in the legislature, and those who govern, like ordinary citizens, are required to obey the law. Well, what's a constitution? As it is understood today, a constitution is a plan that sets forth the structure and powers of government. Constitutions specify the main institutions of government. In doing so, constitutions state the powers of each of these institutions and the procedures that institutions must use to make, enforce, and interpret law. Usually constitutions also specify how they can be changed or amended. In the American conception of constitutional government, the Constitution is a form of higher or fundamental law that everyone, including those in power, must obey. Many controversies surround written constitutions, including what the words mean, whether the understanding of the document should evolve or remain unchanged, and who should have the final say about what the document means. Nearly all constitutions are written. Only 3 of the world's major democracies have unwritten constitutions. That is, constitutions that are not single written documents. Those are Britain, Israel, and New Zealand. In each of these nations, the Constitution consists of a combination of written laws and precedents. Constitutional government means limited government. Government limited by the provisions of the Constitution. Limited government is characterized by restraints on power as specified by the Constitution. In democracies, for example, one restraint is the inclusion of free, fair, and regular elections. The opposite is unlimited government, in which those who govern are free to use their power as they choose, unrestrained by laws or elections. Aristotle described the unlimited government of a single ruler as tyranny. Today, the terms autocracy, dictatorship, or totalitarianism often are used to describe such governments. Believing that they've been subjected to tyranny by the British king, the founders also believed that the government in the newly independent United States of America should be limited by the higher law of a written constitution. Well, how did the founders characterize higher law? Well, according to the founding generation, a constitution should function as a type of higher law. A higher law differs from a statute enacted by a legislator in these 4 ways. First, it sets forth the basic rights of citizens. Second, it establishes the responsibility of the government to protect those rights. Third, it establishes limitations on how those in government may use their power with regard to citizens' rights and responsibilities, the distribution of resources, and the control or management of conflict. And finally, it can be changed only with the consent of citizens and according to established and well-known procedures. This concludes the reading of our 3.1 reading. Please make sure you refer to the text and your notes as you answer the 3.1 questions. Good luck.